CERIAS 591, there is a sheet that's going around.
All right, we'll go dimmer in just a moment here. Before we get going on our seminar speaker with Carter Bullard, I'd like to announce the results of our poster contest. As you know, we had 29 posters this year. And each year we pick 3 of our industrial partners to help us by patrolling through the room and interviewing students and reading through the posters and hearing the presentations. And then it's never a simple process, nor is it a well-defined process, but we get in a room, we just talk about what we liked, our 3 sponsors do, and then we start fighting, and then we flip a coin. No. They identify some of the things that they like, and it's usually an interesting idea, a well-presented idea, those sorts of things. So we really don't have any defined criteria, but we had 3, actually 4, we couldn't narrow it down to 3. We try to have a first place, second place, and an honorable mention. First place, the students on that poster share $250 as the award. Second place shares $100, and then a certificate for our third place poster. So this year, we ended up with 2 honorable mentions, and those individuals, as far as I know, could not be with us here this afternoon. But if they are here, please wave your arms. So one of our honorable mention posters was J.S. Locker, Flexible Access Control Policies with Delimited Histories and Revocation. There were 2 students on that, Christian Hammer, and then Gregor Richards was the presenter earlier this afternoon. The other honorable mention poster was Malware Analysis and Reverse Engineering Quick Evaluation System. That was from our forensics lab. Corey Gwynn was the presenter, and he is the only student on that poster. And then our second place poster with, I think one, my understanding is this is 1 Purdue student and some other collaborators elsewhere, I think. And this is using context profiling to aid access control decisions in mobile devices. Aditi Gupta was our presenter. Were the other presenters with you, or were they students? Are they from Nokia?
Yeah, they're from Nokia.
Okay, so you will have the $100 prize, and we will arrange to get that to you later on. So could you stand and... And our first prize poster this year is Kernel Malware Analysis with Untampered and Temporal Views of Dynamic Kernel Memory. The presenter today was Jingwan Ri. Would you please stand? Ryan Riley was also on the poster. He graduated, 2 years ago? Last year? Okay. So, or the other, let's see, Dongyan is a faculty member. Is your other, Yu Shang Zhang, is that a student, or is that another faculty member? That's all I need to hear. The $250 is all yours. Congratulations. Thank you. Okay, thank you. And again, see me afterwards, and we'll arrange to make the award.
Okay. I guess they can start recording now. This is the Computer Security Seminar, and this week we have a special presentation because of the CERIAS symposium. Today's speaker is Carter Bullard. He's from a company called QoSient?
Quotient.
QoSient.
Yeah.
You pronounce it quotient even though it's an S rather than a T?
Well, it's
All right.
Talking to a mathematician.
well, there's no U, so we got to figure out how to do that.
All right.
Yeah.
No, you. And Carter's title is Society, Law Enforcement, and the okay, Internet models for give and take.
Okay.
So
Thanks, Sam.
take it over.
I really appreciate that. I got to thank CERIAS for inviting me to give you guys a talk today. It's a real pleasure. I've known Gene Spafford since he was a graduate student at Georgia Tech. Give you a little story. I was the graduate student that took over the machines that he managed when he was a PhD student at Georgia Tech. And I can tell you, you didn't want to get those machines. Oh my God. So I've known Gene for a long time, and I followed both COAST and CERIAS, and it's such a pleasure for me to be here, so thanks for the invitation. I have another reason to be here. I've started doing some collaboration with Bill Cleveland, who's on CERIAS's faculty, doing a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, or at least a part of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. But when Gene asked me to give a talk, I went through about all the slides that I could find, and I said, well, I got to give CERIAS something that covers it all. I got to get some technology in there. I got to get some security. I got to get policy in there. I got to get as much as I can. So it's a dense talk. I only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to go through all the slides really fast, right? So how long do I have?
5-0.
To 5? All right, good. So I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis before I get started. I'm going to try to talk about the history of how society interacts with telecommunications and how that relates to security, okay? There's a huge history, fits in the PSTN, but now we have this internet thing where it doesn't fit into how society interacted with the PSTN from a law enforcement and a security perspective. So there's some problems, but there's some new technology, new trends that many universities, government, and corporations are doing that looks really similar to what the PSTN did in the 60s and the 70s. So I'm going to try to highlight what that is, and then I'm going to pose a couple of questions at the end to try to get you guys to think about this a little bit, all right? So that's the premise. So I've only given this presentation once before. I've changed all the slides, so if it sucks, I apologize, but I'll try to get you through it, all right? So we are in an interesting time. I think hanging out with Spaff, you're aware that he has an opinion about whether there's cyber warfare or...
That's too dark, don't you think? We can't see our speaker. You all vote real quick. Would you like to see? Would you like that or...
I'm not really that interesting.
Back to this.
Yeah, let's go dark.
Go dark?
Yeah, if that's okay for the guys up in the front.
Well, you'll look shadowy.
That's okay. The slides are infinitely more important than me anyway. So we're at a time in which the shift is going from cybercrime to cyber warfare. There are a lot of reasons for that. It changes the way the government wants to think about cybercrime. Is it really going to give us something in the long run? Or is it something that's just going to be short-lived and a nice focus? The biggest change is that the public sector defense infrastructure is going to change its funding. And it's going to attract a lot of thoughtful people into thinking about warfare instead of crime. That's not necessarily a terrible thing, but it's different. And it's going to have different results, okay? The strategy, cyber warfare, is kind of counter to what's really going on in the real world. Most cyber security issues are cyber crime. I estimated 99.9. It's only because I didn't put another set of nines at the end of it. All right? It's really the way it works. There are very few, it doesn't matter how you measure it, it's only a handful of demonstrable cyber warfare incidences. There are hundreds of thousands of cyber crime incidences, okay? And the technology that's used in both are the same. They're not inventing new stuff in cyber warfare. They're just using it at a different scale. Oh, excuse me. My thing fell off. The CNCI initiative, the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, is going to shift things towards cyber warfare at a nation-state level for the government, which means things like enhanced monitoring. Doesn't have to deal with issues like privacy because it's a national perspective. They're going to be monitoring infrastructure in which there's no implied privacy. So for the most part, a lot of the technology they're going to develop is not going to be sensitive to privacy for the population as a whole, right? They need to share data in different ways than the way we would share data outside of a military or a classified environment. So the solutions that the CNCI is going to come up with for tackling some of these problems may or may not be appropriate for the private sector. But there's a possibility that it could come up with a surveillance strategy that is acceptable, all right? God only knows. We'll have to see how it goes, right? However, there are public-private partnerships in place that the government has been using for 30 or 40 years that actually might be a focal point for all of this stuff, right? So far, so good? Sound all right? Interesting? If you look at how law enforcement, which is the Justice Department, which is the government, the US government, in the private sector, how do they interact with telecommunications for security purposes? It's through our well-known situation of wiretapping, right? Seem reasonable? But there are three kinds of wiretapping, right? There's pin register, trap and trace, and there's content interception. And each one of them requires a different level of court involvement and justification in order to get there, right? We're all familiar with this. The problem is, when you talk about telco and communication surveillance, you forget that law enforcement goes to a different data source 100 times more often when it wants to do investigations into civil and criminal situations. They go to call detail records. And they don't need a court order. They don't need to go to a judge as much as they need to just get a subpoena to get telephone records for what people are doing, right? If I had a civil dispute against a company, I can actually get their call detail records. It's very simple. I have to go to the court, go to the registrar, give them a good reason for it, and they'll give them to me. Isn't that amazing? I just love that. I just love that. This graph is really important because I think a lot of people have a misconception about wiretapping. The blue is pin register or trap and trace, I can't remember. Green is content interception. 2009, there were 517 wiretaps, legal wiretaps done in the United States. That's not a lot. There were 785,000 requests for call detail records in the United States at that time. Now that's an interesting thing, because when you start talking about network surveillance and data surveillance, everybody starts talking about content capture and packets and all that kind of stuff. And they're not thinking, how has law enforcement evolved with the PSTN over 160-something years of the PSTN? What has the relationship actually been over all those years? It hasn't been, let's go to content capture first. It's been somewhere else, okay? The public-private partnership is really interesting. There are no laws regarding how, except for one, there's one statute, for how telcos deal with billing records. And the only statute is that they cannot give them away for any purpose without your permission. That's the only statute. It's pretty much oriented towards keeping the telcos from using your call detail records for marketing purposes. But society, over a long period of time, has decided that call detail records don't really give up that much, so we're willing to let people see them with a little bit less of a justification than we do for trap and trace, pin registers, and content. Okay, that's really the big message here. And what it all boils down to is this blue thing right here. CDRs, the access to CDRs by law enforcement and your spouse wanting to get a divorce or whatever, is a minimization function on wiretapping. They don't do so many wiretaps because they go to CDRs as a first pass filter, all right? You didn't call the guy who killed your wife 30 seconds before he killed your wife. Okay, well, you didn't do it. Well, that's not true, but you get the idea. They use them a lot. Is there a reason to consider CDR equivalence for the internet? If we're so dependent on CDRs for law enforcement for so many civil and criminal scenarios, why aren't we developing that, engineering that, and putting it into the internet? Why aren't we? That's the question of this, and that's the talk that I want to give today. So what are CDRs and why do they exist? So the telco industry generated CDRs while billing is the first reason. That's really a secondary justification for CDRs. They actually use them for traffic engineering first. They use it for network management, and fraud detection was the biggest reason that they had CDRs in the very beginning, all right? But because they did a good job developing them, they converted it to a billing strategy of per-call billing strategies, and it worked really well. But one of the minor things, though, that they used CDRs for was right down here, a concept called non-repudiation. Now, if you're a security person, you have an opinion of non-repudiation. But non-repudiation, back up. Non-repudiation is considered to be one of the most powerful security countermeasures that there are. It impacts every theoretical attack strategy that's known. It's a system of audit in which, if you understand the definition of non-repudiation, it's I do something in the network or in a facility. A non-repudiation system keeps me from saying I didn't do it. Okay? A lot of people think that has to do with cryptography. It has nothing to do with cryptography. Somebody in 1992 or something like that put out a paper demonstrating how you could do non-repudiation with signatures, and the whole industry grabbed onto it and thought that that's what non-repudiation is. But if you go to ITU recommendation X805, which is the security architecture for systems provisioning and end-to-end architectures of communication, you find out that non-repudiation has nothing to do with cryptography. Okay? It is the most powerful countermeasure because it goes directly after degradation of service. It goes directly after repudiation, which is a big deal. It's a really big deal. And it has secondary security. It's a secondary security countermeasure for unauthorized use, modification, and disclosure. So it really is a big deal. But we have a very poor understanding of what it really is. It really is auditing, okay? I get an audit trail. I can use that to do forensics, and I can prove that you sent that TCP connection to that other machine yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock, okay? And network auditing is something that's been around for a long time, but it was forgotten for about 15, 20 years. So the Red Book, which is a part of the Rainbow series of documents that came out in 1987, the only thing that the Red Book was the interpretation of the Orange Book for networks, okay? And the only thing that really came up as a big deal was not the mandatory and discretionary access control, which was the primary protection mechanisms. It was the audit that was specified in the standard that made it an onerous standard. Nobody knew how to do it in 1987. Back then, we were talking about a megabit per second of Ethernet traffic and disk speeds that were really slow. How could we monitor a network at a megabit per second and generate an audit trail that we could analyze and do forensics on? It was an impossibility. Now we're looking at 40 gigabit per second networks, but terabyte disk drives are $100. So it's an approachable problem now. So it's something that actually is something that you can technically and practically embrace. But you couldn't do that in 1987. In a lot of ways, that's where the Red Book started to break down and why it kind of fell out of favor and common criteria came in and replaced a couple of years later. The goal was to provide accountability for all network use. Every network packet on the wire needed to be accounted for in order to build a system that supported non-repudiation. Because the concept is, I need to go to that well of data, and if that transaction's not in there, you didn't do it. I mean, that's really what the system is all about, right? And the utility, it creates real deterrence. If you really think somebody's going to catch you, you aren't going to do it that way, right? You're going to have to be a lot more clever. You're not going to use the network to break into that box if I can say that you broke into that box. You know, you're not going to do it. Well, one would think that you're not going to do that, right? But the utility comes from the quality of the information that's generated and certain properties. It has to be comprehensive, can't be statistical. You have to have good retention. It has to cover the time period in which you think the problem is going to exist, so you have the data available. It has to be searchable. It has to be processable, so it can't be 47 terabytes sitting on a floppy disk that you can't get to. Right? So there are a lot of characteristics built on the utility of these systems that make them valuable and important. Right? Now, I'm going through all of this because we're building these systems today. Purdue runs a system just like what I'm describing for the network traffic that it sees, but it doesn't meet these criteria, all right? And that's the important part. So I was lucky enough to have been the first networking guy at the CERT at Carnegie Mellon. When it first got started, I was employee number 7, hired in 1989, 1990. And I got to work on this technology then. And we ended up building a network flow system that was only goal was to audit every packet on the wire. We were going to do a red book audit system for the internet, and we did. It was very, very elegant. It's still there. I still maintain this as an open source project. It's called Argus. I think a few people know about it. I don't think Purdue is using Argus currently for their enterprise border security mechanisms, and shame on you. It's free. And I provide free maintenance for friends, and so you would get free maintenance. Currently, flow-based systems are prevalent, and in some cases, they are the principal defense mechanism for some of the most important infrastructures today. There are unclassified and classified systems and we know that one system uses flow data because of the unclassified document on its privacy impact said, hey, we're using flow data, and it has these contents. So there are, flow systems are the principal forensics mechanism being built today to Purdue cybersecurity. But they're not going to get to this point where they have utility as non-repudiation systems unless they have these certain characteristics. And you're not going to get that from NetFlow. You're not going to get that from SFlow, QFlow, JFlow, or any of the commercial flow systems that are integrated into routers. Okay? Okay, so let's move on. So here I've just mentioned, if you don't know anything about flow data, it really is, hey, A is talking to B, lasted this long, here are some characteristics and attributes about it. It lasted this long, and thank you very much, put it in a disk. Looks an awful lot like you called your mother, and it lasted for 27 minutes and 18 seconds. Thank you very much. These are the general open source or generally available IP flow systems of today. Okay? YAF-Silk is one built by the CERT today, and DHS uses this in some of their systems, so it's a very, very prevalent system. All of these are pretty much available. IPDR, though, is probably the most interesting one because they snuck in with the ITU and with the Cable Labs guys. So every cable set-top box modem in the United States can generate flow data of the IPDR format. It's designed for billing and usage accountability, not for security, not for forensics at all. But it does exist. So probably if you have a couple of Nokia cell phones, you have flow data generation technology in your cell phones. You just don't know about it, but that's okay. So why do we want to do IP network auditing? Well, it's great stuff. I mean, if somebody broke into your facility 4 months ago, and you need to go to a central database to go find out who could have accessed that device from the outside, if you had a flow monitor on your enterprise border, you would have some data information to suggest that IP address 2.3.4.5 accessed that device. That's huge. You know, a lot of people, most universities, yeah, who's doing? I'll get to that next slide. So a lot of universities, a lot of corporations, DoD, a lot of Defense Department people, and a lot of government people are using IP network auditing. They're trying to, at least, right? Principally used for forensics data analysis for post-attack identification, attribution, and some mitigation. Near real-time strategies for zero-day vulnerability analysis is probably the biggest thing that people want the technology to do. They want to build near real-time sensors and alarms and event generation systems around flow data that's generated on the wire. But it's expanded over the last 20 years to actually drive enhanced network situational awareness systems. The CERT has a whole situational awareness division that looks at the Carnegie Mellon Group, that's looking at how can you take flow data and do interesting real-time, I want to know what's going on in my network right now. And you can build these systems really well. There always are supplemental systems for firewalls, IDSs, and other event alarm generation devices. And most commercial products like ArcSight will ingest this kind of data and try to correlate it against IDS alarms and alerts so you can get a better sense of what's going on. When you're doing a really good job with it, you're doing network fault attribution. And when you're really doing a really good job, you're looking at performance. And you're trying to imagine that performance is the asset that needs to be protected. So I'm going to use this sensor to tell me how my performance is because I'm really worried that somebody's going to impact my performance. Some people say, what does that mean? Well, we all know about distributed denial of service attacks. That's obvious. Most of the sophisticated attacks today are degradation of service attacks, not denial of service attacks. They take away 30% of your capacity. They induce 10% loss on your links. It decreases the efficiency of your infrastructure, which slows you down. So sophisticated that it's almost impossible to detect because it's not an overt fault. No, there aren't any red lights going off. Nobody's complaining other than the fact that the help desk is getting 12 calls saying my email isn't working very well or it's not going very fast. It's so effective that it has become one of the assets that the Defense Department in the gig and especially in defense in-depth strategies are starting to include performance as an asset that must be protected. Availability, bandwidth availability, asset availability. I got to get to the file. The file server has to be available. All of these things are starting to evolve. Why else? IP network auditing, deterrence. It's one of the best deterrences that there are. If you think there's any possibility of you getting caught, maybe you think a bit about that strategy for trying to break into something. Okay? All right. So, who's doing it? So you got, I was at Carnegie Mellon, still have a good relationship with them. Stanford University, University of Chicago, and New York University are universities that use Argus specifically as the principal security mechanism for the universities as a whole. I would say that there are 15 to 17,000 universities that are using either NetFlow or SFlow with various different collectors trying to do this. And they're doing it that way because these devices are generating this data. It's integrated, it's free, it's cheap. And a lot of companies want them to try to do that. The government's doing this, a lot of ISPs. This list of companies are just the companies that I do business with, or I have relationships. I'm not getting any money off of this stuff, so I can't say I'm doing business. But these are the ones that I work with the closest in terms of doing this stuff. And they seem to be happy. They're not complaining too much. But when I talk about deterrence, the deterrence is extremely interesting. This is a slide from a study that Carnegie Mellon did on their own network. This is about 8 years old, so it's not brand new. The dorms were saturating their links to the outside, downloading videos and doing all sorts of stuff. Carnegie Mellon has an open policy. They really didn't want the students to eat up 90% of their available bandwidth, so they tried to put in hardware, priority queue boxes so the students would get less priority, and they did that. And it just made it look a little bit better, but they still were popping up at the top. Within 2 hours of sending email to everybody in Carnegie Mellon describing the quota of network traffic that each individual was using, within 2 hours, they got that. Okay? Within 2 hours of sending out the first notification, boom, it all started coming down. This is real deterrence. Okay? Firewalls throwing packets away, that's not a deterrent. Sometimes that just compels somebody to turn up the volume and try to send more packets, right? Because you're not going to get caught. Nobody's looking at what IP address is blowing that device at a million packets a second. But you tell a 17-year-old guy in the dorms who likes to watch movies that somebody's looking at how much bandwidth he's using that month, he'll stop doing that. Just like that. Because he doesn't want somebody to know what he's doing. Now this curve stayed down for about maybe a year and a half, and then it started coming back up. Interesting enough, the students started monitoring their own traffic, realizing if they got to their thresholds, and they started to peg it back up again. But then we changed a few things. But when I talk about deterrence, this is the kind of behavior I'm looking for. I'm not looking for a 10% drop. I'm looking for an 80% drop. That's a real deterrence, right? And it becomes manageable at that point. So that's the kind of deterrence that we're talking about. Most people want to monitor at their enterprise borders because that's the threat, them versus us. Only people on the outside are going to try to get in here. So everybody puts their flow monitors at their enterprise borders, either on the outside because they want to see what people are doing hammering their infrastructure, or they put them on the inside so they can do policy verification and validation. I just want to make sure my firewalls are filtering what they're supposed to. So if I put a flow monitor on the inside, I'll only see traffic that got in and out. And that's not a bad thing. A lot of people put sensors on both sides because they want to know that the filters are being tested. They want to see that somebody's trying and it didn't go through. So a lot of places have multiple sites, so they put them on their far sides and they put them on their near sides. But as you watch a university or organization proceed with this strategy, after about a year or two, they start to add more sensors, right? If I'm only on the enterprise border, I'm not seeing what the chemistry department's doing to the physics department. So I need to put sensors down there. As you see that evolutionary progression go, you recognize that because wireless systems allow people to come in from the outside, Target was broken into because a car was sitting in the parking lot, wired into a PC with a wireless connection. They trashed that machine, became an insider, and just sucked everything out of an in system in the infrastructure, right? Having something on the enterprise border, of course it didn't see anything. There wasn't any traffic going across the enterprise border. It was getting sucked out the back of a PC, sitting right next to the window where the managers was, So they only had to be 20 feet from the device. They could just sit in the car in the parking lot and suck it right back out. So you find out you're going to have to put sensors everywhere if you're going to do a really good job. That's expensive. That's onerous. You have to manage it. So most sites in the evolution of this will have enterprise interface sensors creating these CDR repositories, all this flow data. And then they'll scatter them around where their assets are really important, right? Now this is an important distributed information system architecture. It's an ad hoc system. At Carnegie Mellon, you find out that there are 50 of these scattered all over the place. You really would like to get access to all of that data all at once and do data mining, analysis, and all sorts of stuff. Why are they doing this stuff? Because they really want to know the impacts of attacks. They really want to know that something's really happening. If I have sensors at in systems at the top, on both enterprise borders on the side, then I can watch all the traffic that's going between the two. If I collect them at a central place, I can correlate that data. I can ask questions about loss. I can ask questions about availability. I can ask lots of questions about operations. I sent a packet. Did it get there and did it come back? These sensors are, because they're comprehensive, have all that information in them, so they have a lot of utility. They can do a lot of good stuff. That's why universities and corporations are doing this. But if you have an interesting sort of an attack scenario, like a denial of service attack, most sites just see that I'm being attacked. Oh my God, it's really ugly. They really want to know that the attack is really coming from the outside. And they really want to, inevitably, they really want to guarantee that it's not coming from the inside, spoofing external addresses because it's some guy who got fired and decided to turn on his botnet that he installed inside your corporation and is blowing you away, all with addresses that are Chinese addresses. I mean, you should all recognize by now that it's incredibly easy for me to put a static route in this router right here that says China is over there, and one PC can look like the entire People's Republic of China to your infrastructure. That's so incredibly easy to do. And the only way that you're going to tell that that's going on, let me go back up real quick. See, I put this square right here. China is supposed to be up here. But here's China here. Because I put a static route in the next hop router that said China was over here. the only way you're going to detect that is that this sensor sees China and this sensor doesn't. And that's easy. It's really easy if you have a non-repudiation system that has every transaction in it. So when you go to the well, it says, do you have anything from China there? And if he says no, then you know that no traffic from China went past that sensor. So you know it's internal. Is this important? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Why is there a big question mark as to whether China is the country that's attacking the United States? Because 6% to 7% of all attacks involve router rootkits, where routing is statically done to make you think that the attacker is out there when he's really the PC right next to you, actually in the apartment next to you. 6%. These are really important numbers. And the problem is forensics analysis causes you to chase down 50 blind alleys before you come back and realize that, you know, that was the guy over there that was attacking us. So when you get into this scenario, the overarching goal, what would be nirvana for the government, would be to have sensors everywhere that sees these distributed denial of service or degradation of service attacks or any kind of modification of service attacks, and through a mediation system can tell devices that they should do something about it. Better to block traffic on the ingress part than to let it come through the core and block it at the end. Well, you're chewing up valuable resources, letting the denial of service attacker eat up massive amounts of real resources to drop his traffic at the last component along the path. That's crazy. You're only saving yourself. You're not saving anybody else. So the beauty of a system of distributed sensing with near real-time access to non-repudiation quality flow data is that you may be able to build a system inevitably that can attribute traffic, understand its source, and when you mediate by putting in rules, you actually see the effect of your mediation. You actually see that the flow goes down. A lot of people envision that all I have to do is put a new rule in a firewall and walk away. Well, you still got to monitor to understand the effectiveness of the rule, right? And you want to keep coming back. If you follow government policy, FISMA compliance, there's a new FISMA compliant capability called continuous monitoring for policy verification and validation. And these kinds of systems are evolving ad hoc. Universities, small groups are doing this themselves because there aren't any products to do this. They're doing this trying to meet these requirements, trying to understand how can they approach these things because they can't buy this stuff. And the important thing that I want you to recognize is that flow systems for the internet were not engineered and designed by the internet gods. In fact, if you follow the IETF, there was a very famous mail thread called Raven, where at the end of a 6-month email conversation, the IETF made a public statement that they would not develop any technology that directly supported law enforcement surveillance technology. So they didn't help. They're not developing technology that helps in this area. So people are doing this on their own. They're grabbing the tools that make sense, and they're building these systems. And these are the kinds of systems that people are building. GE has built this kind of a system with public domain software. I get pissed off at them because they don't spend any money on it. They use free software and make it themselves. They're not spending any money. It's very hard to make money if nobody's spending any money. This is important, by the way, because this is evolving on its own, very much like the PSTN evolved their own call detail records. The ITU did not specify call detail record formats. There is no collection format for call detail records. There is for wiretap. There is for lots of stuff, but not for call detail records. It's a proprietary, homegrown thing to support a business. And these systems are being homegrown to support the business of the business, where networking is a part of that business. Now, why is that important? The important part is it is the phone company, Purdue, is an internet service provider for the Purdue community. They have a vested interest of doing their own monitoring for their own quality of service for their own operations. They are collecting CDR equivalent data for the internet, okay? Can law enforcement show up at Purdue's door and expect to get access to this data like they get access to call detail records at the phone company? They should. This is my personal opinion. I think they should. The reason I think they should is because call detail records are a minimizing function for wiretapping. They really are. Everybody's so afraid that the NSA or some organization is collecting every packet and looking at everything in the internet. And regardless of whether they are or not, I cannot speak for the NSA. Thank you very much. If you have an alternative that's been proven over dozens of years to keep the government and law enforcement from going to the content collection well over and over and over again, you probably would want to get that into the internet, because we really don't want them looking at everything that we're doing, because that's a real invasion of privacy. But what is it going to take to make these types of CDRs useful? Well, they got to exist. Law enforcement has to expect that they're there. They have to have tools that can consume them and analyze them. When you really go down this path, district attorneys have to be familiar with this stuff. Judges have to have some awareness of it. Juries have to have faith in this data. It's not just something that you throw at a lawyer and all of a sudden he's saying, oh, I'm going to get you off the hook with this data. Oh, yeah. That doesn't happen. But you got to start somewhere. Now, we're in a position now with the CNCI going after cyber warfare. You're seeing that they want exceptions to privacy laws. They want to extend many of the existing laws to increase their ability to have access to communications content, right? I'd like to propose that if they formalized internet CDRs, they don't have to regulate them. They don't have to demand that you create them. But if you as an organization recognize that if you had them, you're going to keep them at arm's length and control the information that they are going to ask for, it may actually be a good solution. But it's something that academics have to think about, all right? Because inevitably, the only proof of a system before you implement it is that you've thought about it. It makes sense. It can be argued. You can stand up in front of a bunch of lawyers at CALEA, the FBI division that's the Carrier Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. These guys, there are more lawyers there than FBI agents, one, and they won't let you do anything because the laws say they can't do that. And so when they talk about data, they don't have any concept of what it is. So they don't want to do anything because it's too difficult of a problem for a lawyer to try to understand. But if you have academics that think about this problem, that can present these abstract notions to them in a way that they can understand them, then you can make some progress, right? My thesis in this particular talk is that call detail records are being generated and being collected by private organizations because they have real value. And I think that it's in everybody's best interest to see how can we improve those call detail records so that when something like law enforcement shows up, they actually have utility for them too. And then we can say, go away. No, we do not have to give you access to every packet on this network for the next 6 months because somebody accessed NASA during a launch and they're afraid that a terrorist lives in Purdue and they're going to have to do total surveillance of Purdue for 6 months to be happy. You don't want that. I think public debate, this is not a topic that people get excited about because it's billing records. That's the least sexy thing in the telco industry that there is, right? But when you show people that if Purdue has got a 1 terabyte flow record repository that they use every day, and GE has one, and I'm going to go to this picture right here and say, imagine this isn't just Purdue. Imagine that this is the cable company. Imagine that this is Purdue. That's West Lafayette up there. Whoever has domain, if everybody had flow records and a simple query interface to so that I, law enforcement or somebody else, can ask, hey, did this IP address come from you? Are you willing to tell me that this IP address is involved in this illegal whatever really came from you? If you had the data and were willing to say yes or no, maybe that's the only answer that you give law enforcement on this question is yes or no. You're going to save the government, you're going to save law enforcement, you're going to save yourself huge, massive time and a lot of heartache. If every cable company in the United States did this, then you're probably going to see most of the spam go away. Because you're going to know why, who, how much mom and grandma's PC is supporting the spam email industry, right? You would legitimize the ability for carriers and service providers to use this information to their benefit and our benefit. And because we've already decided that telco CDRs are not content capture, we'll let you have them with a little subpoena, not with a court order. I think socially and policy suggests that the community should accept this as a reasonable first step intrusion into your privacy, but it's not so huge that we're all going to get bent out of shape about it. So no URLs, you don't even have to have headers. Although, I mean anything past the transport header. Just A was talking to B with these bytes and these packets at this time of day, and that's all. That's all we really want, or would need. That's all law enforcement would need to get the ball going. So if you think that that's a terrible thing in privacy for you, understand that it's going on in the phone company all the time. If you think it's okay, then maybe you think it's okay for the internet. And I think that's a pretty big deal. So, on the other side of this argument is the PSTN itself. Because PSTN is going to voice over IP, it's going to all sorts of different kinds of transport. A lot of PSTNs are not collecting CDRs anymore. So even the ability for the police to understand kidnapping behavior, someone who is taking your child and is threatening to kill her or him unless you give them the $100,000, normally CDRs are available to help the police go and figure out who's doing that. But because of the technology changes, even the PSTN CDR source is starting to go away. All right? And there are no current statutes on guaranteeing that it exists, so there isn't any there isn't anything the government can do to compel these organizations to continue to collect this data. So is this a national security vulnerability? I mean, it's not a cyber problem, it's a real problem. We rely on CDRs for law enforcement every minute of every day. And that, to me, is a serious security problem. That, to me, is a serious cyber security problem. Because I tend to think that the PSTN is a cyber system. But I'm kind of weird about that. OK, so that's the notion of my talk today. I hope you found it compelling. I hope it gets you to think about some of this stuff. If you're really bored with it, that's fine. Most people are bored with billing records. It's not very exciting at all. But I think if we had a system in place, we could do some pretty amazing cybersecurity work. And my presumption is that CERIAS likes to do that kind of stuff. So I was hoping you guys would be a friendly audience for this kind of concept. But I'm interested in talking to anybody, whether they like it or not. So if you have any questions, throw them at me, all right? And thanks for the time.
Let me turn the lights on in case we want to take some questions here.
Any question? Come on. Come on. Come on. God.
Okay, so
Good.
maybe you can summarize the main intuition of your talk. What I get is that you're saying that if all the ISPs and all the enterprises maintain flow records, that would simplify life not only for law enforcement but also for citizens.
Well, yeah, nobody really cares whether you're helping law enforcement, right? And that's okay. That's not a big deal. But how does it help you? And how does it help your understanding of what to do with the flow records you're actually generating? So Purdue is generating and retaining flow detail records, IP flow records, right? It's a very common practice. CMU does it, Stanford's doing it, most people are doing it. So
let me see what that means. Every session that I set up from my computer is logged.
yes, yes. Interesting, isn't it? Did you know that? Did you not know that? Well, let's hope that every cybersecurity professional in the world understands that right now, just about every university in North America is collecting flow records and sticking them on a disk. Now, it doesn't mean anybody's looking at them. It just means they're creating them and sticking them on a disk. Now, they're useful for the security guy so that when somebody like NASA shows up 4 months later and says that somebody in your organization trashed a machine at NASA when we tried to do the last shuttle launch, we delayed it, and it's going to cost you $75 million, and we know it came from your organization, so send us the check tomorrow. Well, that's an untenable situation, right? So you go through your logs and you say, no, it wasn't a Purdue student. They were really coming from Stanford. Or who don't you like at Purdue? IU. They're coming from IU. And I know it's coming from IU. They've been doing it every day. You want to pass the liability off to the actual organization that is causing the problem. Stepping stone attack strategies are about as old as it can get. So having a central log that helps you to understand the nature of how you contributed to an incident is really important.
And that could happen because of spoofing?
No. Somebody just found a PC that they could break into at Purdue. So if I'm going to break into his machine, and I think he's doing some monitoring, I'm going to break into his machine and break into his machine from that machine, because now he's going to think he did it. And it's going to be hard for you to realize that I was the source of the attack. Okay? And that's a very common mechanism. And one of the reasons why people don't even know if it's China that's doing all this bad data exfiltration is because we all know that it could be a Russian that's broken into a Chinese machine that's actually attacking something else. So the idea of being able to analyze your infrastructure to understand your liability and your culpability in an incident is really important. And so that's why universities and corporations and small government groups are collecting this data so that they can have a historical forensics capability when they get hammered. Okay? So, but what do they do with it? So what are their retention policies? How long do they hold on to the data? Who's going to get access to that data? You know, or do you get access to your own flow records for research purposes, for instance? Why not? But it's owned by Purdue by law, so because they created the data, it's their facility and all that infrastructure. So many universities that are involved in these kind of programs are formally defining these policies as to who should have access to records, what purpose are they going to serve, should they be anonymized, should they be available, and what the retention policy is supposed to be. Do I need to keep them for 6 months, a year, 5 years? The government, by law and statute, has to retain some data, doesn't really matter what it is, for 5 years. So there's some organizations that think that they have to retain their flow data for 5 years simply because it's government data. Carnegie Mellon, the Naval Research Lab, where I did a lot of work before, creates about 75 gigabytes of flow data a day. So a 5-year retention policy is, it sounds like a lot, 50 terabytes, 25 terabytes. I'm not multiplying in my head, I'm guessing 25 terabytes. 10 years ago, that's impossible. Today, it's as easily doable as, buying a car. I can probably buy that much terabyte for a lot less than your car. So it's an easily approachable problem. So, but these records are being collected for their utility, not to serve these other purposes. So the biggest challenge is a university like Purdue, does it want to formalize its flow systems, develop these policies, or do they want to avoid it and just not even tell anybody that they exist and we use them for this purpose and that's it? And I think that's a big question.
So going back to this example, suppose that I am a Purdue employee and somebody breaks into my computer from somewhere else and does something which causes damage.
Right.
Then the flow record of Purdue
Well, no, if somebody broke in from a machine on the outside to your machine, it would know that that was the source. The flow, good flow data will indicate the source of the traffic. Bad flow data will just say that the two parties were engaged in a conversation, and it won't tell you enough to know, did you trash him or did he trash you?
So you're assuming that somebody, the malicious guy is ISP, the malicious guy who broke into my computer, he also maintains the flow data.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Also maintains the flow data.
No, your university has the flow data.
So how is the university proving that I was not the malicious guy, because the flow did originate from me?
Oh, well, it would take some analysis, but if you're good at it, it's pretty easy to understand the initiator versus the responder, the sink, and all that kind of stuff. If you're not any good at it, if you have very bad security people or you have poor data that's been collected, then they can ruin your career. You know, in a really paranoid environment like a classified military installation, the notion that you would be culpable in an internal attack is a career eliminating move. All right. So the idea that people are collecting data and sticking it somewhere without any necessary sense of the quality of the data, the quality of the analyst that's looking at the data, and all that kind of stuff, could be a liability, could be an issue. The nice thing is all of this stuff is really early, all right? So Purdue does, I'm saying Purdue does it. I don't have direct knowledge that Purdue was doing it today. I knew many years ago that Purdue was doing it many years ago. I don't know what you're doing today, so I apologize. I love to use the example that you're doing it, so you got to pay attention to this. But you want to have this kind of forensics capability because you do not want to be implicated incorrectly in a cybersecurity event as a cybersecurity professional. That would be a very bad move, right? So you would like to have, as the basis of the forensics data that analysts, law enforcement, or whoever's going to use, the best quality data that's available. And that's why I talk about formal non-repudiation systems. Grabbing the right technology, thinking about what you're doing, having good retention policies, having a good awareness of the quality of the data, why the data exists, what its purpose is, and all that kind of stuff. Because it's going to be used in lots of different kinds of ways. And I think that it's not something that we can avoid because it is the move is already there. I mean, you have organizations that are completely committed to flow-based cybersecurity surveillance and forensics. This is the state of the art today. So the notion that a university is doing this themselves, that's to be a given. They've been doing it for 15 years. To think that today they're not doing it, no, you should expect it. And the notion that you might get upset and pissed off about it, or there might be an issue, great. You know, that's something that you have to explore and understand as a cybersecurity professional. But I think that you should recognize that there's huge value to these kinds of systems. At least I think so. Yeah. Bill.
Let's set the record straight here. That Purdue is monitoring the network. The principal thing they do is to monitor net flow, the records, on each individual person in the dorm, make sure that they're not exceeding the rules and regulations or limits.
Acceptable use policy verification.
They're also looking inside of packet content.
Mm-hmm.
To try to determine, these are done with commercial products. So this is, the students sign at least the undergraduate, I don't know what the graduate students get monitored like that. But I do know they do that with students who try to keep the network from being overwhelmed by, say, lots of peer-to-peer stuff. You have to do that. And if you don't do it, I mean, we'll be able to do it. So that's number one. Number two, I should understand this whole notion of maintaining flow records is, as Carter was saying, it's really the next step that we can take to provide much better protection for our inside networks like this. I mean, if you had subnets around the university that were routinely monitoring connection level information, that could be used as a very powerful mechanism for being able to determine when attacks occur. So it's not really quite at this personal basis what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's really more about
It's
figure out when somebody breaks through.
It's really, most organizations, it's an organization liability issue, not an individual liability issue. The university wants to run better. They want to, Carnegie Mellon, like 16 other universities on Internet 2 were lawsuit against them for digital rights management violations because students were downloading movies and a couple of them were redistributing movies to their buddies, all right? And the digital rights movement guys, man, because they got lawyers, they are going to know and they're going to come after you. And they did. $15 million lawsuit against Carnegie Mellon. They went to their Flow records. They didn't have a problem. So they just moved that liability right off the table and moved on. The digital rights guys are saying, no, 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 we've got proof. And Carnegie Mellon saying, no, because we know without any shadow of a doubt that these students that you're claiming were involved in digital rights were not a part of that virtual overlay network that was moving data around. Now, there were other students the digital rights movement guys didn't recognize and didn't understand, and they got hammered, but they didn't tell the digital rights movement guys that those were the students, not those students. So having this kind of data is very helpful. Sometimes it's damaging and can be upsetting. I think that the only thing I want to keep reminding you guys is this is happening just like it happened in the PSTN, okay? The PSTN did it on their own. They needed it to run their infrastructure, to make money. They figured out these public-private partnerships to where law enforcement could get access to them, and that has benefited everybody. We want this because it has solved lots of problems. The question is, do we want that same public-private partnership to exist for these IP data records?
So for phone records, I could see how non-repudiation exists.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's, so when somebody makes a bad call on a Sprint cell phone, Sprint has no incentive to lie.
Right.
Say, he didn't make this call or he did make this call. It doesn't help them or hurt them, so why not just give law enforcement help them out?
Right.
But in your scenarios for like Purdue has a big incentive to lie and say, this didn't come from the Purdue network.
Oh, no, no, no. Because one of the beautiful things about some of these systems is because somebody else is also collecting these flow records, they are somewhat there's some self-integrity checking mechanisms. So if I have a guy who's got a flow system here, and he sees traffic, and you're saying that it didn't come through me, more than likely there's a third sensor that's going to say, oh, no, it really did. So what are you doing? You know? But there's no incentive for an organization to do that as a general purpose rule. Okay? I mean, you can imagine a dictator ruler, regime who's going to take over the internet system and do all sorts of real crazy stuff. But understand that you have faith in the CDR system, right, of the phone company. They use it for billing disputes. They give you your record. You say, I didn't make that phone call. You give it back to them, and they say, I'll give you your money back. So it's an economic thing. There's no reason why the same system can't exist for data, all right? And it's only really faith that you believe the CDR system is really solid. But the reality is that these systems do exist, and the public has put this faith in them and actually done a lot more than that. I don't think there's no reason why we couldn't do that with this stuff in the internet. And I think there'd be great benefit if we did.
Following up on that question, if you're trying to assign liability at the individual level rather than organization, how easy or how difficult would it be for the individual to cover his or her tracks by stopping the collection of this kind of...
Oh, right. So there are models where you actually put sensors in every laptop. Okay, and that's a good model actually for end-to-end performance evaluation for wireless infrastructures is you want to put some sensor that's doing performance monitoring on every end system so they can understand loss, availability, connectivity failures, and stuff like that. So if you have a sensor in the laptop and that's the only source of information to say whether he's going to some porn site or he's trying to break into the administrator or something like that, sure, he's going to find the file that has the records in it, insert bad records, overwrite records, or whatever. So maybe that's where cryptography comes in, and we'll sign them and close them up and make it so you can't modify them. But the idea is to have a third-party monitor that's embedded in the network itself that is protected so that nobody can get access to them to modify the streams. But yeah, you have to be very careful. I mean, in the law enforcement world for content collection, the J standard, I don't know if you're familiar with that, how does a content wiretap box transmit its content to another device that the law enforcement's going to use? There's standards for encryption and all sorts of protection mechanisms to guarantee that there's a chain of evidence that hasn't been broken. So you would expect systems that were really elevated to this level to have something like that. But as long as they're performance devices, you don't care. It's when you elevate them to law enforcement quality, evidence systems that you really got to be paranoid with it, I think. But I'm just trying to frame it a little bit. Is that helpful? See, this is getting good. And we still have some time. Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious because the internet, as a general entity, has a tendency to try to anonymize itself when it can. You talk about reactions.
Yeah. Okay. Anonymize itself when it can.
Well, I mean, you talk about users, you're tracking, when I visit your website, I'm going to split my IP address.
Lots of paranoid people want to hide a lot of stuff.
Right, and I'm just kind of curious, you mentioned, this kind of technology wasn't possible, 20 years ago when the internet was being built. At the same time, you hear a lot of talk of moving to true P2P,
Yep.
communication without the use for, centralized systems. Do you think a move like this will push that idea further into realization, where people will start to push that kind of P2P idea much more strongly?
So I think that your question is because new protocols and new strategies trying to kind of obfuscate or hide themselves in the infrastructure might make this unusable, or it would have to change in order to accommodate those new systems?
Not so much that, but because this is based around gathering data, and the internet does have a habit of trying to, when it can,
Ungather data.
As a population, it tends to try to avoid having data gathered on it. You have blocks, no script, you've got all kinds of things.
Yep. So when this stuff started, I was at the CERT and we presented at Cisco in 1991 this concept, because we knew that and about 4 years later NetFlow popped out of it, but we wanted to take 70% credit for the idea. They wanted to give 0 credit for the idea. So that's how that kind of went. At the time that I was presenting this, there was a whole bunch of people, real heavyweights in the internet industry. Most of them said, well, this isn't going to fly because there's going to be so much encryption that you're not going to be able to see the headers to even do any of this flow stuff. Well, that was 22, 3 years ago, and still the amount of encryption in the internet is like under 5%. So there is this notion that there's lots of paranoia and then there's lots of manipulation, but the common user who's really an email user with a laptop, and that's what you're most interested in. You're interested in the guy who's trying to hide, because more than likely he's the one that's also capable of mounting an attack, right? Or at least facilitating an attack. The user with a laptop that really doesn't have any control or have any awareness or any knowledge can be culpable in an attack because their machine's wide open and they get it, and the machine becomes an attack. But it's the infrastructure that's trying to hide, not the person, So I think if you have general purpose sensors, not that are designed to go after a particular problem, but as a general purpose sensor, going after general purpose concepts, you're going to pick up a little bit of a hint of this kind of stuff. And sometimes, for instance, my sensors will actually tell you about fragment overlap attacks, right? You know about those? So I got a fragment, it's got root in it, first packet. The second packet just writes over the root and you don't see it. The other guy, you know what I'm saying. Just seeing that somebody did that is the biggest red flag, and you should be knocking on their dorm door right now, because that's such a sophisticated manipulation that there's no way that guy is not doing something he's not supposed to be doing, okay? But you get a guy who's blowing 15 million emails a day out, more than likely some bot's taking over and is doing something else. So once you start looking at general matrix data, you can actually weed out those interesting parties, and you can pretty much classify them in different ways. So regardless of whether they encrypt or whatever it is that they're doing, a call detail record is just simply saying this IP address talked to that IP address. I don't know what he said. I just know he lasted for 17 minutes and 27 seconds and he moved 700 megabytes. So he probably moved an HD, 2 HD movies and something else. And that's about it. And that's all that's there. So there's not much to hide, not much to obfuscate. not much collected, but the value is huge. Because now I know I can build a social network of what your PC's talking to. Not to track you, but that's the fear. And that's, remember Poindexter with his comprehensive data mining programs that really put him on the edge and they fired him and all that kind of stuff? That's probably the one thing that these systems kind of step towards, giving people enough data where they can start doing that kind of analysis. But to think that that analysis is not being done already is a naive position. So I think we have to embrace this stuff, think about it, come up with policy, come up with how we're supposed to effectively use this stuff, how can we make it better, and eliminate some of these problems. Is that reasonable? What do you think?